Our next speaker that we have, I'm just as excited about. I actually got the opportunity to meet the speaker last year at our Global BioFest. So I'm excited to welcome back Dr. Kristen Lear. I'll bring Kristen in. Hello, Kristen, welcome.
Hello, everyone. I'm excited to be here.
Yes, we're thrilled to have you. Do you just want to pull up your screen share while I tell people who you are and what you're up to? So,
Yes.
Dr. Kristen Lear is a bat conservationist and an environmental educator. She's an amazing award-winning public speaker and science communicator, and shares her stories and her passions, which we will hear today, for bats on all sorts of platforms, ranging from podcasts to radio shows, National Geographic stage, even CBS's Mission Unstoppable TV show about women in STEM. Kristen's currently with Bat Conservation International, working on the agave restoration as the program manager. So I'm sure we'll hear about that today. But I'm excited. I know that we're going to feel her passion and enthusiasm come through as we hear about your work. So, Kristen, I'm going to bring in your presentation,
Awesome.
and I'll let you take it away from here.
Sounds good. Everything good to go on the presentation?
Yes, looks perfect.
Okay. Awesome. So yeah, thank you everyone for being here. I am excited today to talk a little bit about the work that I'm doing at Bat Conservation International to restore agave plants for pollinating bats and for people. This is honestly my dream job. I've been working with bats for quite a while now, so I'm very excited to share a little bit about our work. Before we dive too much into that, I want to talk a little about my journey into bat conservation, because I got started at a fairly young age, unofficially in bat conservation. So I want to, if there's any kids out there, kind of share how I got started, and that it's really never too early to start. And then I will talk more about our agave restoration initiative that we have at BCI. So my journey in bat conservation began when I was in 6th grade. So when I was 12, and I built 4 bat houses, you can see here, for my Girl Scout Silver Award. This was, I'd always been interested in bats and really been fascinated by them. And when I was doing my Girl Scout Silver Award, I wanted to do something to help bats. So I built these 4 bat houses in a local park in Cincinnati, Ohio, where I grew up, put them up. And that was my first taste of bat conservation. And just FYI, if anyone knows bat houses, this was a while ago. These are not the best designed bat houses, so don't take a page from my book here with these bat houses. After that, I continued really loving bats, and then in college, as an undergrad, I got the opportunity to study bats in Texas as an undergrad field research assistant, helping a PhD student with her bat research. This was my first time actually getting to, be trained on how to catch bats, measure bats. We did radio tracking. And again, I also built bat houses for my senior honors thesis project. So this was when I knew for sure that bat conservation was my dream and my passion. So after college, I got a Fulbright scholarship to go to Australia and spend a year living in South Australia, where I studied the critically endangered southern bentwing bat in Naracoorte Caves National Park. Lived there in the national park for a year in their bunkhouse and got to study this population of this critically endangered species. And then I knew ultimately my goal was to earn a PhD in bat conservation. So I ended up at the University of Georgia in the Integrative Conservation PhD program, where my research was integrating the natural and the social sciences to understand the complex conservation challenge of these pollinating nectar feeding bats in Mexico, agaves, and people's uses and livelihoods that are based around agave plants. And so this was 6.5 years of my life studying these bats in Northeast Mexico, studying the people and working with the people to develop conservation based around agaves. And now, here I am at Bat Conservation International, leading our binational restoration initiative to restore agaves to the US Southwest and Mexico. So this has really come full circle, and honestly, couldn't be happier than where I am right now. So let's get into this. What are we doing to protect these nectar feeding bats? So little nectar bat, or pollinating bat 101. There are over 100 species of bats around the world that eat nectar. So about 8%. We currently have over 1,400 species total around the world, and about 8% of those eat nectar. And these nectar bats pollinate over 500 different plants around the world. They are critical pollinators of plants like bananas, durian, cacao, which we use to make chocolate, agaves, obviously, which we use to make tequila and mezcal. And bats are very effective and efficient pollinators. They tend to carry more pollen on their bodies. They get covered more than things like hummingbirds or butterflies or bees. And then they also tend to fly farther distances when they're foraging. So they tend to spread that pollen over farther distances and to more plants. And when we look at here in the US and in the Southwest and in Mexico, we have 3 species that come up into the US, into Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. We have the endangered Mexican long-nosed bat, the one shown on the left. We have the recently delisted lesser long-nosed bat, which is a huge conservation success story. And we have the near threatened Mexican long-tongued bat, which is kind of a more elusive species that we don't know quite as much about as the other two. And I want to show these range maps of both of the Leptonicterus species, the long-nosed bat species, just to show how far they really are ranging. The yellow is the Mexican long-nosed bat, and then the purple is the lesser long-nosed bat. And they're really ranging from southern Mexico, southern central Mexico, all the way up to northern Mexico and the US Southwest. And what's happening during this range, or in this range, is it's the pregnant mother bats, the females, that are making a long distance annual migration between their mating caves in central Mexico all the way to the US Southwest. So these are some of the juvenile babies, the young pups that they have. And these mama bats, while they're pregnant, which is a crazy feat, they travel over 700 miles while pregnant to reach their maternity caves or their maternity roosts where they give birth to those babies. And along that journey, agave plants, like you can see here, provide energy-rich nectar to fuel that migration. Agaves are amazing, beautiful plants. They can grow 30 feet tall, and they offer hundreds of these nectar-rich flowers that the bats can feed on. And then in turn, the bats get covered in pollen. You can see all here the yellow pollen, and their long tongues go into the flowers to lap up that nectar. They get covered in pollen, and then they spread that pollen. So they're critical pollinators of agave plants. And like I said, agaves are especially critical for these pregnant female and mama bats that really, in some of these places in northern Mexico and the US Southwest, really are relying on agaves as their main or only nectar source. Up in northeast Mexico and in Texas, agaves are the only blooming flowers that they feed from. So they're very important for these mom bats. And agaves also provide cultural and economic resources for people. In Mexico, agaves are harvested and used for beverages, agua miel and pulque, and then we have syrup here, and of course liquor, like tequila and mezcal. Agave stalks, like you can see here, are used for building fences and buildings. The leaves and the stalks are chopped up and used to feed cattle and goats or livestock. And then the whole plants are they're planted as living fences like here, or used to control erosion. So they're extremely important for people too. And honestly, agaves are just beautiful, iconic parts of all the landscapes where they're found. These are all other wildlife, they support the soil and overall ecosystem health. But more and more, what we're seeing and what those mama bats are seeing as they're migrating are landscapes like this, where these landscapes used to have agaves, but because of agricultural expansion, because of livestock grazing, because of urbanization, because of drought, These landscapes are looking more and more like this, with no flowering agaves, no food for these bats. But what if we could take that and turn it into something that actually helps? And that's what we're trying to do. We've seen, unfortunately, with the Mexican long-nosed bat that, with this land degradation, we've seen populations of Mexican long-nosed bats crashing by about 50% over the past couple generations of the bats. So this really is a critical, urgent issue. But again, what if we can go from this to something that looks like this, with a forest of agaves, with a connected corridor of flowering agaves across that entire 700-mile migratory range to support both the bats and people that rely on agaves for their livelihoods. And that's what we're trying to do. So our agave restoration initiative really is a binational effort across the US Southwest and Mexico, where we're working to restore agaves near known bat roosts, so where we know these bats are using as their stopover sites along their migration, but also along that entire migratory corridor so that there is a connected landscape of nectar for these bats. And again, I want to show these maps because this really shows the scale that we're working at. This is not something we can do, one site and we save the bats. This is really a landscape level initiative. And these are just some of the areas where we've been working. We're currently expanding our work into new areas and new sites to really create this connected corridor. And of course, this is not something that one group can do on its own. This really requires all hands on deck with researchers from universities, government agencies, NGOs, communities, and even industry members, all working together to plant agaves and restore agaves. And these are just some of our partners that we work with. So our approach really is kind of three-pronged. So the first approach is looking at planting and restoring these native agaves near those critical bat roosts. So like I said, around areas where we know the bats are and where they're roosting. We also want to protect the current agaves that are there. So it's not just about planting more agaves, it's about protecting the healthy agaves that are already in some of these areas. And then, of course, that migratory corridor is critical. So we are working to identify where exactly that migratory corridor is, and then working to plant and protect those corridors. So we currently have work happening in 6 US and Mexican states. It's a diverse landscape with diverse partners and diverse actors, and it's really a fun work to get out there and actually work with people to restore these agaves. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the achievements we've had to date because I'm really proud of the efforts that we've done. This initiative has been going for about 3 or 4 years now, so we're still in the thick of it and already have had some great successes. So we started our work in the US Southwest because you'll see here, this is an area in the New Mexico boot heel where there is a cave that both of these long-nosed bat species roost. And this area is expected to become even more important for both species with climate change and with potential range expansions or range shifts for these species. So we started in this area also because we have very strong partnerships with local partners in Arizona and New Mexico. And so we started by doing some pilot agave plantings. And you can see in this left picture with the Boy Scout, and he has this little baby agave, about a 3-year-old agave. Agaves are quite easy to plant. They are hardy. They don't require a lot of care once they're out there, and anyone can really plant them. So we've had lots of great planting events with groups like the Boy Scouts, with mining companies, with the National Park Service, lots of diverse groups helping plant these baby agaves. And we've also worked with our local partners, in particular our nursery partners, to create these protocols, booklets, detailing the process of agave restoration, from seed collection to greenhouse creation to propagation of those agave seeds, and then eventual outplanting into the wild. So these booklets we're really proud of because it's something we can share and we can use. And these are on the Borderlands Restoration Network website if anyone is interested in learning more about these protocols. And to date, we've helped support or build 7 community and nonprofit greenhouses across the US Southwest and in Mexico. We have 85,000 agaves growing across these 7 greenhouses. So that's a lot of agaves that take 2 to 3 years to grow to planting size. And then once they are of planting size, we plant them out in these critical areas for bats and for people. So we've to date planted a little over 18,000 agaves, but with these 85,000 growing, we're poised to do a lot more coming up. Now, shifting over to Northeast Mexico, this area is a very important area for maternity roosts, particularly for the Mexican long-nosed bat, where the mother bats give birth to their pup and raise their pups. And in this area, the approach we've been taking is really community-based conservation, working with the local ejidos or these rural Mexican agrarian communities to develop long-term community agreements and do capacity building, help here in this picture learn how to do sustainable agriculture, sustainable ranching, and also incorporating agave restoration into those approaches. And to date, we have 11 community conservation agreements in place, which is really exciting. These are 10-year conservation agreements. And it's very important that we have these long-term agreements because agaves take 2 to 3 years to grow to planting size. And then once they're planted, they take another 5 to 10, even 15 years, or maybe even longer to grow and mature and shoot up that flowering stalk. So this really is a long-term commitment. And so far with our partners in Northeast Mexico, we've been successful in protecting 8,500 hectares of land for restoration. So this includes land where the communities are using it, you can see in this picture, are using it for sustainable crops, as well as for agave production. And they're letting some of those agaves flower for the bats, and then also be able to use some of those agaves for livestock fodder or other uses. And our partners have been really active in working with these communities. They've worked with these communities for over 10 years now on other projects. And they've led community trainings and trained currently 79 community members in these sustainable agricultural and ranching practices. So this is a much more holistic approach, like I said, than just planting agaves. It's much more holistic than that. And as part of this work, we've also been working with our local partners to basically train the trainers. So we have some education programs with local school teachers to learn about bats, and then they can then teach about bats in their schools. And then in protected areas, these protected area managers are learning how to do agave surveys or how to do vegetation surveys, as well as some of these conservation measures. And our local partners have really been active. Obviously, when COVID came around, it kind of put a damper on some of these community projects, but so far they've trained 30 school teachers and protected area managers as these environmental champions, which is really, really exciting. Now, if we shift over to the lesser long-nosed bat kind of range over in Western Mexico, we've been working with a really awesome partner, Colectivo Sonora Silvestre, to engage Bacanora producers, so liquor, agave liquor, like tequila and mezcal, to engage these producers in these practices that support flowering agaves for the bats. So they have they're working to actually include flowering agaves for bats, as well as some other very ecological approaches into the actual certification for Bacanora itself. So they've been working with the Sonoran government to get this off the ground. And they've created these sustainability standards that include these practices that support nectar bats. And they've engaged 11 Bacanora producers in some way and are really trying to expand that to reach more of these producers. And of course, education and outreach is a critical part of all we do as bat conservationists, because bats tend to get a bad rap. They tend to be not as charismatic as a polar bear or a koala. So we have to really work hard to show how important bats are and how cool bats are. And so we've been doing a lot of community outreach. Our partners do a lot of school talks about bats and school activities. We've done an annual Bat Fest in Monterrey in Mexico every year for the past few years, except for last year with COVID. And we've also done a lot of virtual programming, which has allowed us, especially in COVID, to continue reaching people and reaching diverse audiences. So to date, we've reached over 20,000 people locally throughout all of these, the 6 states where we work, and over 1.5 million people through virtual programming, which again, it always blows my mind how many people you can reach with virtual programming. So this has been really exciting for us. Now, the last piece of the puzzle is this piece right here. So, we talked about how these mom bats are migrating from central Mexico. They're going northward up through northern Mexico. And then they're landing in some of these sites in northern Mexico and the US Southwest. And there's this really interesting gap here between Big Bend National Park in Texas, where there's a maternity cave of Mexican long-nosed bats. And then there's this, like I said, the Boot Heel of New Mexico has a cave where both of these species roost. But we don't know how they get between those two caves. There's been a lot of work, in northern Mexico, but not a lot of work to find where these bats are migrating through to make that last leap into that Boot Heel of New Mexico. And so we're working right now to find where is that migratory corridor. And actually, this works really well after Natalie's talk about the DNA work that she's doing. This will actually tie in very well to that. So I'm excited to share what we've been doing with using some really cool DNA technology. So first, we have to find in that range in West Texas and in New Mexico, we have to find, where are the agaves, first of all? Where could these bats even be with their food? So we've developed an iNaturalist project where people in the community or any naturalist group can go out and mark where they see agaves, especially these flowering agaves. And then this is the really cool part that I'm really excited about. We are working to develop eDNA assays, so environmental DNA, picking up the DNA left in the spit from the bats that they leave behind when they're feeding on these agave flower and the agave nectar. And you can see from this video, they really kind of shove their faces into those flowers. They get spit everywhere. And we can collect that spit basically and try to see where these bats are feeding. By the way, this is slow motion. So these bats are really rapidly eating from these agaves. But we've been working with Dr. Faith Walker at Northern Arizona University to develop qPCR, or quantitative polymerase chain reaction assays, that can detect all these two leptonicterus species. And we're hoping this year to be able to develop a third assay that detects the Mexican long-tongued bat. So with that, with those 3 genetic assays, we'll be able to test swab agaves for all 3 of these nectar bat species. And when I say swab these agaves, this is what I mean. So we tested this protocol in Big Bend National Park last year in this left picture. And what we're going to be doing this year and in coming summers when these agaves are flowering is literally go out and swab these agaves. You basically attach this Q-tip, a long Q-tip, to the end of a pole that we rigged up with duct tape. And you just swab the agave. And you pick up the spit from the bats, and then we can put those Q-tips in a vial and send it off to the lab for testing. And this, like I said, we can test for all 3 species, or we will be able to once we finish the work this year. And then we'll be able to deploy these surveys across that whole range and go and swab these agaves to find out where these bats are going. And once we know that, we can then work to restore agaves and protect those areas for the bats. So before I end, I just want to talk a little bit about what our future plans are. So where are we going with this agave initiative? So we are currently working to expand our restoration efforts into this migratory corridor once we identify the key areas, and also a little farther south into some other known mating or maternity routes for these species. So working with additional communities to expand the reach to that entire range where they need it. We're working with the governments in both the US and Mexico to establish agreements, long-term either monitoring or protection agreements for these species. And we're really excited over the next year or two to really launch some community green agave business enterprises. So, this is a picture here of a woman-led organization in Northeast Mexico in Nuevo León, where they make agave products and sell them on local and regional markets. And so we're working with these communities to develop sustainable green enterprises with these agaves so they can continue having these agaves into the future. And then as part of the work we're doing, we're really looking to link agave restoration to food security, using those greenhouses, not just for growing agaves, but for growing local vegetables that people can eat, growing medicinal plants, or growing other plants for sale on local markets. And then also tying into climate change efforts, climate change mitigation efforts. Agaves do sequester carbon. They are being used in some parts of Mexico for carbon sequestration programs. And so we're looking to hook into that as we move forward with our agave work. And I want to end on this quote because I think this really encapsulates the whole initiative and why we're doing what we're doing. And this is a quote from one of the community members in Northeast Mexico who said, "For us, the agave is so noble that it gives us life." And I think that really covers it all. Agaves give life to bats, agaves give life to people, and agaves give life to the ecosystems they're in. With that, I want to make sure we end on time, but have time for questions. So feel free to reach out. There's Bat Conservation International's Instagram and Twitter. I am also on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook at Bats for Life Kristen. So thank you, everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kristen. That was fantastic as always. It's that quote you ended on, I think just as you said, sums it up so well and so beautifully. But I can imagine that when you guys are going down to kind of pitch the idea of agave restoration, the community members are pretty receptive to and wanting to work together with you. When you go and start restoring the agaves, and in the 7 to 10 years they take maturity, how are you going to use the agaves that are restored through Bat Conservation International? Is it going to be through that kind of community enterprises that you mentioned and getting the locals involved? Is it going to be like certain farmers that get the agaves, or kind of how does that equity piece work with the agave?
That's a great question. So I think it's really interesting. The approach that we're taking, first of all, is very different in the US versus Mexico because it's very different, social systems. So yeah, when we talk about Mexico, and in particular Northeast Mexico, it's the community agreements. What we're doing is we work directly with the community council. So they have a voting council, kind of like, a town council in the US. And they vote. They decide whether they want to have these types of projects or not. And so that's the first part, is they decide yes or no. And then in terms of who gets access, we're planting on communal land, and we're doing these restoration efforts on the actual communal property, which is usually the majority of the land of the community. Each person also does have their own, or each family has their own parcel of land that they plant their own crops on. But the agave restoration work is happening on this communal land where people can access, anyone can access it. And it's basically working with the community to design approaches that work for them. So, it's not like, we're not saying you can't harvest those agaves. That, first of all, wouldn't be ethical in the first place. And also, we want to make sure that they can use the agaves if they need to. If something happens in the future, there's a big drought, and they really need those agaves to feed their livestock, that's part of conservation. That's That's part of it. Obviously, we want some to flower for bats, but it's kind of working together to make sure we wouldn't get to that point in the first place. But yeah, it's not all just about the bats.
Yeah, that's what I think is
Yeah.
so wonderful about the project, is that it really is community-based conservation and benefiting everyone involved. Um, Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us today for our Global BioFest, and for being here and sharing about your project with Bat Conservation International and the Agaves. It's
Yeah.
absolutely wonderful to have you back.
Thank you so much. You guys have a good rest of the day. I look forward to the talks.
Thank you. You too.